I invite the four members of families and friends who are sharing today to come up at this time.
Grow old along with me, the best is yet to be, the last of life for which the first was made. Our times are in his hand, who says, a whole I planned. Youth shows but half. Trust God, see all, nor be afraid. An excerpt from the poem Rabbi Ben Ezra by Robert Browning. The best of life for my father was set at an extremely high bar. He fulfilled an amazing level of personal potential in his life. Many, if not all of you, already know his story. He grew up in a family of successful Sephardic Jewish textile merchants in Istanbul. None of his immediate family members had ever done much extensive traveling. Spurred on by the horrors of World War II, my father made a quantum leap. He was able to book passage to cross the Atlantic Ocean on a merchant marine ship in 1944 in the middle of the war. He made it safely to the United States, where he went to medical school at Northwestern University, became a medical doctor and a psychiatrist. He was an immigrant, a refugee from a predominantly Muslim country, who hid from and sought refuge from racist oppression and genocide in the freest, most powerful country in the world, and in the highest status profession he could find. His success in doing so marked a level of attainment unrivaled in his family background. The amazing level of drive that propelled him through the loneliness, the culture shock, and the highest levels of academic rigor is mind-boggling in retrospect. What my father lacked in genius and natural talent, he made up for in determination and effort. Whatever setbacks and disillusionments may have been in his path, failure was not an option for him. He went on to live an ethical life, serving to heal his fellow human beings in the best way he knew how. He was an enlisted officer, a psychiatrist, and a captain in the U.S. Air Force. He spent some time as an adjunct professor of clinical psychiatry at Loyola University Medical School and elsewhere. He became a fellow in the American Psychiatric Association, a life fellow in 1986, and a distinguished life fellow in 2003. For over 50 years, he worked 6 days a week, many evenings, and literally never missed a day of work due to illness. At the same time, he was a husband, a father, a grandfather, an avid athlete, art collector, party animal, and friend of all, who lived his life to the full. So how can one ever top that in the last of one's life? How, in fact, does this poem even apply to the last years of my father's life? I have pondered over this as I watched him undergo unimaginable loss of quality of life, suffering from memory loss, hearing loss, decreased cognitive ability, living most of those last couple years in a wheelchair in a nursing home. And yet those last years of life were the years of a whole I planned. Youth shows but half. Trust God, see all, nor be afraid. They were the years beyond all the accomplishments, joys, and frolickings of youth, trusting on a level that is beyond everyday achievement and even beyond life and death. So what does this have to do with my father? What was best about the last couple years of my father's life? It was the qualities of heart, one might say, that developed and became the best in those later years. My father's heart remained warm, open, friendly, and deep to the end. In all my communications with him, he was ever giving, not complaining, not angry, never giving up, not one sign of weakness or even of being afraid. He always maintained a quiet air of dignity through it all. An amazing accomplishment under the circumstances. I almost always felt uplifted after talking with him, even if only a few words were exchanged. His heart was a naturally healing heart, and this expansive quality of his heart was what I believe was developed to the best in those last years of his life. Bridgeway Senior Living was his home during those last years. When he was first admitted, the staff just called him Ben, another non-ambulatory elderly resident. But in the last year, I noticed that had changed, and they began affectionately calling him Dr. Ben. A couple of our own exchanges took place when words were few and far between, and will remain in my memory. I said to him one day, "Thank you, Dad, for all you have done for me and given to me." He replied, "My pleasure." A simple exchange. It took us 64 years to get to the best of life. Our last exchange over the phone a few days before he passed was one word. My father could manage to get out one word, Inshallah. I repeated it back to him, Inshallah, a Turkish word that means God willing. My father's stoic acceptance of his condition, but hopeful openness to, and I believe willingly giving himself up to whatever the creative source of the universe had to offer him. So, Inshallah, Dad, thank you for all you've done and given to us. You are the best of life. Thank you.
If there's a will, there's a way. I remember my father telling me as a young boy, and it sounded good. I tested the theory many times over many years before realizing it probably wasn't the best mantra for me. Dad wasn't perfect. He had faults, like we all do. Yet above all, he wanted to do good for the world. So if we take one thing from the life he lived, that's just it. Try to do good for your world.
Well, you've heard from Ben's two sons. I met Ben as a 5-year-old when my father hired Ben's then wife, Betty, to be sort of a surrogate mother to me. And Ben became quickly a hero. He was an athlete. He tried to teach me swimming at Oak Street Beach, North Avenue Beach. One day there was a riptide and a kid got pulled out screaming, and Ben just went like a shark and got him and pulled him back in. He doesn't even remember, he never remembered it, but I do. He also liked to do tumbling exercises. They lived in a manor house on Ontario Street, Michigan Avenue, which was torn down in the early 50s, and they had the second floor. Betty would play her violin, and he would do tumbling exercises with me. One day took me over to the lab, medical school, and he said, "Well, do you want to see what blood looks like?" And I said, yeah, sure. Pricked his finger, put it onto a slide. We looked through the microscope. I thought he was tremendously brave. He was kind of my hero during that period. what a life that he led. And you can see it, you know, in the all of this here. But one has to remember that he and his siblings were born right at the beginning of Kemal Ataturk's reign in Turkey, and it was a rough period. It was only 5 years after the Armenian genocide had taken place. Literally hundreds of thousands of Greeks were killed in Izmir, and even in Istanbul, you know, Jews had to be careful. So the family did something that was kind of interesting. They made various side bets. Ben bet on America. He went to the Roberts College and learned English. His older brother Nassim went to a French school. He ended up in Paris. I mean, they made bets very early. Phil made the point about Ben's passage on a merchant marine ship in '44. Well, I mean, this was a huge convoy, and wolf packs of U-boats were all around. They were forbidden even to make any noise at night and so forth because it would carry through the water, and some of the ships might be attacked. So the family had its own second diaspora. Sephardic Jews, they probably went back to Spain and so forth, and Ladino was one of the languages they all spoke, which is a strange language filled with a lot of Spanish and Portuguese phrases from pre-Inquisition days and some Turkish phrases and so forth. But Ben spoke a lot of different languages. We reconnected in the 60s when he moved back to Elmhurst, and he and Betty had an unfortunate divorce in the early 70s. And Betty later conceded that it kind of wasn't Ben's fault. She was going through some psychoanalytic issues and projected some stuff on Ben. And she also felt great remorse over the toll that it took on her children. But anyway, both Betty and Ben subsequently remarried and to wonderful people. And I think that I want to talk a little bit about Barbara, because in Barbara, he got somebody who was absolutely tremendous person, giving, kind, empathetic, or empathic as the shrinks say, empathetic as most people do. And they had some wonderful, wonderful years together, traveling the world, Sunday going down to Magnificent Mile, Michigan Avenue, having tea and just hanging out, doing various cultural things and so forth. And Barbara had a tremendous influence on Ben. For one thing, Ben was a really crappy driver. And when I say bad, I mean bad. He was ticketed once for going too slowly. Lane markers were mere bourgeois constraints to him. He'd slalom along. So very early in the relationship, Barbara said, "Ben, give me the keys of the car." And he never drove again. Thank God. But there were lots of other things too. In the psychiatric profession, of course, after the 80s, the insurance companies came in, health plans got more complicated, visits became limited, the paperwork became awful, and Barbara ran the office. So when she finally decided that, Ben, it's over, she knew from all the financials and stuff that she had taken care of. So she did a wonderful job. Between appointments, Ben could go out and wander around Oak Brook Mall. The Merrill Chase people, they would attack him because he was a buyer of art and everything, clocks, everything else, and had a wonderful collection. One other quirk that Ben had, though, that you can take the kid out of the Middle East, but you can't take the Middle East out of the kid. He was a snappy dresser. I call it his Pasha style. He wore a lot of bling, bracelets and so forth. And I remember at a family wedding that we were all at, there was a party beforehand in Seattle on this lake, and there were family pictures being taken. Ben was in sort of a sports shirt, but it was tucked in. He decided he didn't like that, so he halted the camera and tore the shirt out so it looked like a, Ferdinand Marcos Gayabar or something like that. And then he was happy. So Barbara took very seriously the marriage vows in sickness and in health, and the later years were hard. She had a brother who had problems and subsequently died. Her mother was very sick along with Ben. Ben was suffering from dementia and hearing loss and so forth. But she never, ever complained. And she did her duty, and it was incredible to watch. So we must give a shout out and a salute to Barbara and her wonderful kids too. Kate and Chuck are sitting next to her. And to the Ben-Ezra kids too. It took a little bit of time for them to get used to their father having somebody else in his life, but they eventually came around, and so did first wife Betty, as Barbara did everything she could to help the family in terms of when the kids visited, this one will stay here, this one will stay there. And in the last months of her life, as she made the move for her husband, she was riddled with cancer. She made the move to assisted living for him because she knew that he couldn't make it without her being around. And Betty was just flabbergasted at all the wonderful things Barbara did. So that ends it. Shards of memory, we all have them. But for me, Ben is the bronze god on North Avenue Beach.
This generation always on their phones. It's wonderful to know how much my grandpa meant to so many people and to hear all these stories of his brilliant career in psychology and his military service, his journey to this country, his love for his family. And he certainly meant the world to me. I was reflecting on sort of the impact that he had on my life. The thing that I just kept coming back to was his home at 35 Windsor Drive that he made with Barbara. As a young kid, there's no way to describe the magic of this place. It was like Oz, and Grandpa was the great wizard. And I remember every time that I'd go there, he'd take me on a tour, show off all of his treasures, these incredible modernist paintings, sculptures in the African room that I think I'd get kicked out of the church for describing. These beautiful Turkish rugs, and of course this unending tinkling of clock bells. And, he'd point out some new Chagall piece. I think he had one called The Moil. And when I learned what that meant, I was terrified. Or an African mask that was particularly frightening. And I, at the time, didn't really know what I was looking at, but the thing that I could see was the joy that it brought my grandfather, the wonder that it filled him with. And from a very young age, I felt the power of creativity, of imagination, of filling your life with beautiful things. And that's something that I've taken with me every day of my life. Through my grandfather's example, I learned the importance of curiosity, of celebrating new ideas and experiences. And I will miss him every day, but I'll always carry that enthusiasm for life with me everywhere I go.